Today on Straight Talk Africa, it's finally spring in Washington, D.C., the nation's capital. And that means hundreds of delegates are in town for the annual spring meetings of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. To what extent do these meetings really add value to the vast majority of the African people? That's coming up next right here on Straight Talk Africa. Hello, welcome to Straight Talk Africa, live from the Voice of America studios here in Washington. I am Shaka Sali.
Hello, Shaka, and hello to all our viewers and listeners on the continent and elsewhere. I'm Ayan Bior, your social media reporter. Today is the significance of the annual spring meetings of the World Bank and the IMF to Africa. And coming up later, our audience has weighed in on our topic through emails, Facebook, and Twitter comments. And we'll reveal some of them ahead on Straight Talk Africa. Most people planning to attend this year's World Bank and IMF spring meetings have already arrived in Washington. Although the main event officially begins Friday, several civil society forums are already underway. My colleague Paul Cisco has more on the story.
The goal and mission of the World Bank Group and International Monetary Fund is twofold: to end extreme poverty and to boost shared prosperity. Jim Yong Kim, the president of the World Bank Group, says the first path to achieving inclusive and sustainable economic growth is laying the foundation for more effective public services, and that's done by improving governance, tackling corruption, accelerating infrastructure investment, lowering real and perceived risks of private investment with fair trade policies for all, and also by creating markets, bringing the benefits of private sector innovation to developing countries. The second path is to invest more and more effectively in people. He's calling on the thousands of government officials, academics, private sector leaders, and civil society members to invest in human development, provide better health care for all, particularly prenatal health care for pregnant women, and resources that will prevent malnutrition in children. Kim says more funds for education are needed that will prepare students for the jobs of the future, and the building of social safety nets that meaningfully protect the poor are urgently needed. In today's world, demands for digital competency are accelerating. Low-skilled jobs are rapidly being eliminated. The remaining jobs, and those of the future, are demanding new and sophisticated skills. The World Bank says it's the world's largest funder of climate-related investments. A recent World Bank study shows that regarding one's aspirations, satisfaction with finances, standard of living, and relative happiness depends largely on where you are income-wise with those you compare yourself to.
Keeping up with the Joneses used to be about keeping up with your neighbors. But it's not only about the Joneses living around you now. Because of connectivity, the Joneses could be living anywhere in the world. Now, we know that connectivity in the developing world has expanded.
And that's a good thing. Internet access for the poorest 20% has nearly doubled since 2009. In Africa, home to 1.2 billion people, 226 million smartphones were internet connected by the end of 2015. By 2020, that's expected to triple. 750 million Africans will be connected to the internet. Worldwide, 2 billion people are living in countries affected by fragility, conflict, and violence. And the World Bank says that terrorism incidents have increased 120% since 2012. Again, Jim Yong Kim, World Bank Group President.
By 2030, 50% of the global poor will live in areas affected by fragility and conflict. We cannot meet our two goals, ending extreme poverty, boosting shared prosperity, unless we tackle the challenge of fragility and conflict.
The World Bank chief says it is the moral responsibility of all to do more to help the impoverished lift themselves out of fragility, conflict, and extreme poverty, and to help stabilize the countries they live in and provide hope for the future. Paul Cisco, VOA News, Washington.
Thanks, Paul, for that interesting report. Joining us here in a Washington studio is Dr. Albert Zufak. Africa Chief Economist at the World Bank headquarters here in Washington, D.C., Eric Lecompte, Executive Director, Jubilee USA Network, and the Reverend Dr. Anyedi Okule, Executive Director, Africa Faith and Justice Network, also based here in Washington, D.C. Gentlemen, I have to say that I'm profoundly honored and exceedingly humbled to have the opportunity to host the three of you on Straight Talk Africa.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's a delight to be with you.
You're most welcome.
Thank you.
Later in the program, we will give you, the audience, a chance to call and talk with our guests. The number to call is 202-619-3111. The US country code is 1. Let me come to you immediately, Albert. Okay. First of all, of course, I have to say, frankly, congratulations for being the first man to occupy that most important position for Africa at the World Bank.
Well, not exactly the first man.
The first man from the African continent.
Exactly. Thank you.
That is correct.
Thank you, Shaka.
Now, tell me, people, hear about the World Bank. They think it obviously has to be very rich. It is supposed to be in the business of development, and they have a lot of hope in the World Bank. And yet, frankly, there are a lot of critics out there who say, you know what? The World Bank, the best it does, it basically talks the talk. But when it comes to walking that talk, it is missing in action. How do you respond to that?
That's a very interesting point. But Shaka, the World Bank is an institution that does essentially two things. One is providing financing, and extremely cheap financing for the poorest countries in the world. And second is provide advice, policy advice, economic policy advice for countries that are willing to take it. So when it comes to action will only take place in countries that actually want things to happen. So we work, especially at this time of the year, this specific time of the spring meetings, to put together a package of financing that is extremely extremely interesting for our countries. The World Bank is availing $57 billion for development in Africa. And we will be working with countries to make change happen in 3 areas. One is sustainable and inclusive growth, especially through financing infrastructure projects. Mm-hmm. The second is investing in human capital, in education, in science to prepare Africa for the 4th industrial revolution. And the third area is to strengthen resilience to external shocks. So these are areas where, we have advice available, we have financing available, but we need partners, and that's why the spring meetings are interesting time, because the counterparts come to Washington and we discuss all these issues.
Eric, you obviously have heard that, and of course you have heard a lot of that before. Is he right? Is it what the World Bank is supposed to do? And if it does, to what extent does it in fact accomplish a bit of that?
Right. Well, I do think that is very much the function of the World Bank. I think there is a reality that around the world, people think the World Bank does more than what it actually can do. I think with some of the new financing that Albert is talking about, some of what's innovative about it is in particular looking, how do you use financing to strengthen economies when they deal with external shocks? And I think part of what we've seen so far as the meetings at the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank have begun is that there is a lot of concern about global financial stability. And I think there's a lot of concern in sub-Saharan Africa when we understand that Since 2010, the debt levels in Africa are drastically rising. In 2010, according to the World Bank, the debt levels were at about 282 billion, and now we're looking at around 420 billion.
Why are they rising?
Well, I think they're rising for a lot of reasons. And I think it's important to note that the debt that's rising is not International Monetary Fund or World Bank debt. A lot of it is corporate financing, it's other development banks. But part of why it's rising is after the 2008 financial crisis, many types of loans, new types of loans became easier in terms of lower interest rates. But unfortunately, because many of those loans are denominated in dollars and the U.S. interest rates are going up, what it means for many countries in Africa that are struggling right now is that their debt payments are going up. So that external shock question that Albert raises is an important one. And beyond the work of the World Bank, we actually believe that the International Monetary Fund and global leaders really need to take that external shock question much more seriously.
I see. What about Reverend Okule? To what extent would you say that these annual spring meetings in Washington are justified?
Yeah, you know, I really was touched by what Albert said about what the World Bank is about, financing and policy. But it is really in the application of those two events that there is a serious problem, you know. Policy issues, financing, development of infrastructure, human development, that's excellent. But in the application of it, it is, in my judgment, fundamentally flawed. Why do I say that? Those who apply this, you know, would I say the middle people, the middle corporations who go into application of these policies or financing or infrastructure development, very often they push an agenda that are very much at a disadvantage to the local communities, number one. And secondly, we find them going in without really having a feasibility study of what is needed in the community for them to advise on how to apply it. I could cite numerous examples across the continent. And so when that is done, for example, pushing privatization without really seeing what are the outcomes to the community, or enacting policies, even sometimes land reform, or even trade policies that are designed to increase international trade, but yet at a great disadvantage to the local communities. I mean, when there's time, I will come back to that. So maybe what he's talking about is a new direction, you know, which will be music to my ears, you know, really. Because what I see so far, the development is more focused on, not focused on the people. So I was glad when you talk about, you know, focus on human development. Yeah. So if that is the case, then we might be seeing a new direction. But so far, it seems that what is happening here, we meet in Washington and talk about this and talk about grand policies, but the person on the ground, the individual persons in the villages, in the small towns, they are not impacted by it. Sometimes they end up at the, what do you call it, you know, at the big cities with corporations, yes. So that's what I'm saying, that maybe the World Bank, the financial institutions have to monitor so much the middle people who apply the policies.
Do you have incontrovertible evidence on that? Okay,
for example, you know, I'm talking about policies here and advising on infrastructure. Let me cite a few examples. Let me start with something I call the politics of pineapple.
Could we wait a bit and perhaps you pick up after the break?
Okay, all right.
We'll pause for a short break, and we want to remind you that Straight Talk Africa is now streaming on Facebook. Just enter the keyword Straight Talk Africa and watch our show live, and don't forget to share it with friends. Also, we are on Twitter and we are tweeting live. follow us at VOA Shaka, that's VOA Shaka, and join in on today's discussion with your questions and comments. Don't forget to use the hashtag VOA Spring Meetings. We'll reveal some of your tweets on air later in the show, and we'll be right back with you. So please, don't go away.
We are able to touch on things that are important to people on an everyday basis. We hope that our viewers are getting inspired when they watch our show. They're getting a view of the world from a different perspective, things that perhaps are not in their immediate vicinity. Today, I could put in on the show something that is a little different, a little unique, and this gives me that inspiration to come to work.
This is Straight Talk Africa on the Voice of America. What is your opinion about today's topic? Call us at 202-619-3111. U.S. country code 1. When you call, remember the following. Ask only one question. Keep your comment brief and turn down the volume on your radio or television. Now let's return to Straight Talk Africa.
Thank you very much, Esther Gizia-Yowat. And of course, this is Straight Talk Africa, coming to you live from Washington. Well, the Reverend Okule, I had the dubious privilege, obviously, to interject because there's no democracy in Studio 52. The producer says, you go, you go.
You have the right, and I respect it.
And I hope that, I hope you'll find some space in your beautiful Nigerian heart. Forgive me for that. Could you please pick up from where I stopped you?
Okay. I talk about middleman policy advice. Okay, let me pick up a few things, two things. One, I remember a case in Nigeria where policy advisors came, first, structural adjustment program that, poof, collapsed the economy. Number two, a group came into Lagos, which is a massive city, very overpopulated, and you know, disposal of refuge is a problem. So they came up with this brilliant idea to build incinerators in the city to recycle waste. Fine. They put in about $2.4 million per each and put several incinerators around, garbage disposal, and they finished building it, and then they didn't study the environment. Afterwards, oops, what is it? The power supply is not enough to generate it. Mm-hmm. And so across Africa, you have hundreds or even thousands of what is called white elephant projects.
I see.
That are not completed because some expert came and advised without really looking at the cultural, social, economic environment. That's one case in point.
Well, I think that we should really allow the expert here from the World Bank to defend himself.
Well, Reverend, thank you so much for these points and for acknowledging that the three-point agenda that I laid down for the World Bank is actually very, very relevant. And in fact, it's not new. Just an example, the World Bank is currently the largest financier for education in the developing world. Just between 2014 and 2016, the World Bank has invested more than $50 billion in education in the developing world.
And what type of education are we talking about here? Surely you are not talking, I hope, about some of these projects which fall under universal primary education or universal secondary education, where people, frankly, don't have any tools.
Well, the World Bank projects in education in the Africa region range from providing textbooks and supplies to children in our villages, to centers of excellence in tertiary education, where we are ensuring that African children, African youth, learn science and mathematics to get ready for the fourth industrial revolution. So it's the wide spectrum of education from projects, building classrooms in Uganda, to providing textbooks to Benin, or helping ministries of education to reform the curriculum in some of the countries. So the World Bank has been investing in human capital development and we are certainly continuing that effort. But let me just tell the Reverend what is actually new in what we are doing. What is new is that at this particular moment, we are rethinking fundamentally the way we finance development. The World Bank is now engaged in leveraging its own resources and working with governments to leverage their own resources to crowd in private capital. Because we've now realized clearly that ODA, official development assistance, is not going to be enough to close the infrastructure gap for Africa, for example. And that gap is $48 billion per year if we are to close the gap for Africa. So neither our budgets, our country's budget, nor the World Bank funding would be enough. So we need to leverage, we need to use those resources as leverage to crowd in private sector. We need to work with countries to build solid public-private partnerships. We need to make sure we create the right regulatory framework for domestic private sector to emerge and foreign investors to join and help our countries sustaining growth.
Eric, you obviously have listened to Albert. Can you define for us, for example, what is development? Because when I was back at college, sometimes people used to confuse economic growth with development. The physical infrastructure or certain oasis in a community, and not necessarily, frankly, that's something that affects the vast majority of people in a particular area.
I think, unfortunately, there is a lot of confusion around how we all use the words of development, economic growth, infrastructure improvement. And I think even though all of those particular issues are connected, as a organization that represents the faith community and looks at how these particular issues impact development, what we're specifically looking at is how poor people, how vulnerable communities are able to rise out of poverty. And I think one of the really interesting points that Albert just made was about the need to close the $48 billion, annually that we're seeing in sub-Saharan Africa in terms of being able not only to put development but economic growth on stronger footing. I think one of the realities that's become a bigger issue at these International Monetary Fund and World Bank meetings is that right now, every year, sub-Saharan Africa is losing more than $70 billion because of tax evasion and corruption. So what we just saw from yesterday's major report on the world economy released by the International Monetary Fund, well, one of the things that was important about that report, it was the first time the International Monetary Fund really said we need global economic cooperation to tackle these tax and revenue issues. Because although ODA, aid, World Bank financing, the Africa Development Bank, while they all have some role to play, the reality is that many countries in sub-Saharan Africa don't need more financing. They need to actually collect the revenue that's there in their countries already.
And what about good governance?
And that's intrinsically linked to it. And I think this also, unfortunately, I know the IMF and World Bank looks at these issues, but the World Bank and IMF, just like the United Nations, are Bretton Woods institutions.
Correct.
So they are sent representatives from those particular countries, and that's who they have to work with. And I think it is, and I just talked with International Monetary Fund staff at a very senior level about the challenge, and this is also a gender issue. It's why when we look at an IMF panel, it's almost all men, because on the country level, not only are we often dealing with issues of corruption, but we're also dealing with gender imbalance.
Unfortunately, it seems to be reflected right here
Yes, that's right. We look like an IMF panel.
That is correct. When you talk about the Bretton Woods institutions, the average guy in the audience, frankly, wouldn't know what you're talking about.
No, they wouldn't. And what that refers to is that moment when many of the global institutions were founded.
Following the end of the Second World War.
Exactly. And it was in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. There was a big retreat center. And during several meetings, all of these institutions came together. And so it's known as the family of the Bretton Woods institutions. But I think the bigger point, that we think is really quite important is that $70 billion a year that's lost in sub-Saharan Africa, it's a part of about $1 trillion a year the developing world is losing. But that $70 billion a year, we know that about 80% of it can actually be stopped because it's tax evasion and corruption happening in very particular ways. So I think one of the issues in terms of both development, economic growth, and infrastructure is supporting our African partners. Part of that is good governance, but supporting our African partners to be able to collect the revenues that already exist in countries that are often very resource rich.
The Reverend Okule, there are some people who argue that the World Bank's probably major weakness is that it tends to interact and deal with the elite. And frankly, does not put the ordinary African, for example, at the center, at the heart of the center. Do they have any point there?
I think so.
Critics?
Actually, I think so. It's the point I was making earlier that, it doesn't fester to the people in the villages, people who really need it. Because when you look at the implementation of the policies, the policies are fine themselves, but the actual implementation is very lopsided. When we have to go from government to government, the elite, you are bringing up the issue of corruption. You are bringing up the people who are there for themselves, serving their interests. You are bringing up issues of privatization, which the elite turn out and buy up the country. So, yes, that statement is not just coming out of the blues. It's observing what's going on, and it is true in many cases that with all good intentions from the World Bank, with all good policies, I have used the word before, the middleman between the policy and the implementation of it becomes a problem. Take, for instance, the issue of trying to improve agriculture throughout the continent. It has resulted in land reforms that has opened up the channel for multinational corporations, corporations, to literally grab land left, right, center on the continent, from Ethiopia through Uganda to South Sudan to Liberia. And people are getting dislocated. And the disadvantage here, let me cite one example. We found out an example in Volta region of Ghana, where Heracles Farms, based in New York here, went in there to promise people development, increased food production, etc. Took the land from the people, but then what was promised did not even mature. On top of that, they had in the contract, which the people signed, not even seeing the fine print, in the contract with expert lawyers from here, that if after they sign the contract, if there is a dispute about this contract, it will have to be settled in a court in Paris, not in Ghana, And so you find issues like this. We have been, the Africa Faith and Justice Network, over the past couple of years, has been talking to local populations in Africa, from Kenya through Uganda, Tanzania, Cameroon, Nigeria, Ghana, and we find this practice over and over. Even in Cameroon, the Nasako case in southwest Cameroon, the same company I mentioned here tried to take up 73,000 hectares of land.
Were those examples, for example, supported by the World Bank, among others?
No, not directly. But that's what I'm saying. The middleman, when policies are When some of the corporations, yes, some of the companies are beneficiaries of, of the financing. That's why I say that the policies of World Bank, as Dr. Zeko mentioned, they're excellent. I clap for it, but the implementation, the middleman that practices it,
well,
yeah,
unfortunately, time is not our best ally. You are tuned into Straight Talk Africa. We'll have more of a discussion in a moment, including our social media segment. So please, don't go away.
Today's youth are not just the next generation of African leaders, they are today's leaders. And this is the time to invest in them, today, not tomorrow. So let's connect. Let's engage with each other on issues that will transform our societies. Innovation, leadership, entrepreneurship, things that you're doing to move the continent forward, to make you the greatest generation that Africa has known. It's Upfront every Wednesday, 17:30 UTC, right here on The Voice of America.
This is Straight Talk Africa on The Voice of America. Call us now with your questions and comments. The number is 202-619-3111 and the U.S. country code is 1. Call us direct and we'll call you right back. Remember to turn down the volume on your radio or television and keep your comments brief. Now back to Straight Talk Africa.
Thank you very much, Efficacy, and welcome back to Straight Talk Africa, live from Washington. It's time to bring in my colleague and social media reporter, Ayen Bior. Take it away, Ayen.
Thanks, Shaka. Thousands of government officials, journalists, civil society organizations, participants from the academia and private sectors are gathering at the World Bank IMF meetings to discuss the global economy and international development. Well, this leads us to our question of the week, which asks, what sub-Saharan African development projects are most in need of World Bank financing? Well, before we begin, I'd like to thank all of you for using our social media platforms to communicate with us. And another reminder that we are tweeting live today. Use the hashtag VOA Spring Meetings. If you haven't yet, please follow us at VOA Shaka. Speaking of it, let's go to a tweet from Tony, who says, transport, electricity, and water, which is vital for survival, as well as interactions. And through this, education can also be easily accessed. Very interesting. Well, we have another tweet from Otega Esemwere, who says, this whole borrowed monies will be looted back to Europe and other parts of the world, but not in Africa. African politicians are evil. Well, let's go to our comment of the week from Simon Ojour, who writes, the World Bank is already financing strategic African projects in energy, education, and infrastructure, specifically roads. These projects are key to economic development and prosperity. However, the problem is the nauseating corruption that's inside our African nations. In Uganda, the World Bank has suspended new lending due to corruption and improper use of funds. Very interesting. Well, let's go to another comment from Facebook fan Haji in Sierra Leone, who says, Africans should not be given cash to finance development projects. Our leaders use the cash to buy weapons to kill their own people, to suppress democracy. Also, they can become presidents for life. All right. Well, our last Facebook comment comes from Shafi Mohammed Igal from Somalia. He says, I think Africa needs special development projects that invest in its youth, especially those youth who have skills to create job opportunities. Very interesting. Well, thank you, everyone, for submitting your comments to us. A reminder that we appreciate all the audience feedback, so please keep them coming. And if you're a new fan, drop us a line at africatv@voanews.com. Once again, our email address is africatv@voanews.com, or post your comment on our Facebook page. Enter the keyword Straight Talk Africa. Interact with our show as it's streaming live. Be sure to visit us online at voaafrica.com, or you can join our YouTube channel. Sign up to VOA TV2 Africa and follow us on Twitter at VOA Shaka. A reminder that the show is streaming live every Wednesday. Go to VOA Straight Talk Africa TV program page on our website, or you can simply watch us live on your mobile device. Just download the VOA mobile app. Now let's take a look at what's on tap for next week's program. On the next Straight Talk Africa, Zimbabwe's persistent economic woes cloud its 37th Independence Day celebration. President Robert Mugabe says better times are ahead, but there are hints of political instability. The ruling ZANU-PF party is waging an internal battle over who will one day succeed the 93-year-old leader. An in-depth discussion on Zimbabwe on the next Straight Talk Africa. Well, that's all for today's social media segment. Shaka, you and the guest have a lot of social media comments to discuss. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Ayen, for sharing with us social media reaction. Welcome back and to the significance, of course, of the annual spring meetings of the World Bank and the IMF to Africa. Our guests today are Dr. Albert Zufak, Africa Chief Economist at the World Bank headquarters here in Washington, D.C., Eric Lacomte, Executive Director, Jubilee USA Network, and the Reverend Dr. Nyedi Okule, Executive Director, Africa Faith and Justice Network, also based here in Washington, D.C. Well, gentlemen, once again, I have to say frankly that I'm profoundly honored and exceedingly humbled to have the opportunity to host the three of you on Straight Talk Africa.
Thank you.
It's our pleasure.
You're most welcome. And, you know, I think, Albert, really, it's your turn. Go for it.
Thank you, Shaka. It's a great opportunity. I won't miss that. First, let me clarify a couple of issues. Eric mentioned, World Bank, Bretton Woods Institution, and staffing. Let me just clarify that staff of the World Bank are not sent by their governments. Governments contribute staff to the board, which is, which governs the institution. But staff of the World Bank enter through competition. So that's actually very, very important. Second, on gender, let me say at the World Bank we have actually made a lot of progress on gender. And 10 years ago, the World Bank president decided to make parity in senior management. And this is observed in the Africa region. Our Vice President Maktar Diop has actually made and implemented that measure. So more than 50% of directors in the Africa region are women. So in my own office, in the Chief Economist Office, we have a Gender Innovation Lab, which is a research unit that understands the policy changes that can advance the lives of women across Africa. So we do impact evaluation, and we run more than 50 impact evaluations across Africa to know exactly how to impact women's lives and improve their livelihoods. So on gender, we are certainly trying and doing quite a lot. Now, on domestic resource mobilization, I think Eric is absolutely right. One of the issues we have in Africa is not that much the lack of savings. It's the fact that Africans export their savings through official and unofficial means and import investment. So we need to do a little bit more in taming illicit flows, illicit financial flows from the continent. In fact, there are numbers clearly showing that Africa exports more resources than it gets back. And it's on us, it's on African governments. You can't blame the World Bank or the IMF for that. Second is the fact that, when it comes to domestic revenue mobilization, especially at this time where our largest economy, Nigeria, South Africa, Angola, are going through tough times. Growth has seriously slowed down in those countries because of the collapse in commodity prices. And these three economies would probably grow at around 1% in 2017. The rest of the overall growth rate that we are projecting for Africa in 2017 is around 2.6%, which is an improvement from 2016, where Africa grew at only 1.3%. But it's still not enough. It's still not enough because we're still below population growth. So even for 2017, Africa is still going to experience a negative per capita GDP growth. This is serious. We need to continue and really deepen the reforms, reforms on the macroeconomic framework, but also structural reforms to improve Africa infrastructure. So this is actually critical, and we just launched this morning the 15th edition of the Africa Pulse, where we're discussing all these macro outlook, but also discussing the type of structural reforms that should be implemented in Africa to improve investment efficiency and improve the efficiency of public spending in Africa and crowd in the right type of private investment. One last thing that I would like to say on domestic resource mobilization, Chaka. A number of countries in Africa, when it comes to fiscal adjustment, cut investment spending. What we should cut is actually unnecessary, wasteful spending.
Such as?
Well, we do have a lot of subsidies in areas that are proven not to actually be helping anybody, including, creating some governance issues. So revisiting some subsidies in some areas would actually be a better way to adjust than cutting investment spending. That's on the expenditure side.
What about like countries in the Great Lakes region?
Yes.
And the Horn and what have you, which seem to spend more money, frankly, in defense, security, not education, not healthcare.
Yeah. No, this is a serious issue. A number of African countries, especially those in the Sahel and in the Horn of Africa, are facing terrorism threats. Security is important for development. We certainly know that. But our countries need to be able to do at least two things. One is to come into a regional discussion, because some of these terrorism threats are regional threats. So no single country can actually be able to address them on its own budget. So it's important for African countries to really start thinking at terrorism as a regional issue and come up with some, ways to reduce those threats from regional, maybe pooling resources at a regional level. Now, the other way to actually do fiscal adjustment better on the revenue side is to raise taxes that do not penalize the poor. In fiscal adjustment, we need to be conscious about protecting the poor. For example, raising taxes on land speculation and real estate in African cities would be a progressive taxation, would not penalize the poor, yet give our countries the means to actually do the right type of investment, public investment that is complementary to private investment. If instead our adjustment on the revenue side is increasing consumption taxes, VAT for example, then we will be taxing the broad-based population and certainly hurting the poor. So these are trade-offs, these are type of adjustments that our countries face. But again, the ball is in our government's court. As much as we believe in Africa that the World Bank or the IMF are powerful, it's actually in our hands. We need to take the right kind of actions, and again, we're here to help.
Very interesting. I mean, he obviously raised a lot of points, and I think I find also that he talked about such as things as statistics, GDPs and all that kind of stuff. But to what extent do some of these statistics, frankly, do you really find them reflected in the stomachs of the people or the communities, really? Because there are some critics sometimes who say sometimes some of these institutions engage in what they characterize as creative accounting. In the 1990s, you had several countries in Africa which were supposedly among the fastest growing economies. China was one of them, Brazil was one of them, and of course you can see China and Brazil, they do have some results. But frankly, when I look at Africa, I don't see very much that reflected in that. How do you react to that?
I think on a few issues. I think when we're looking at the issue of statistics and how those particular numbers affect us, when we throw out a number like sub-Saharan Africa is losing $70 billion a year because of corruption and tax evasion. For a lot of us, those big numbers don't translate. But I think the reality is not only are we looking at these issues from a revenue perspective, but I think the conversation that we're having about corruption is a very important conversation. And I appreciate the distinction that Albert made in terms of how staff are hired at the IMF and World Bank. But what I'm talking about is governance. So whether it's the United Nations, the IMF, or the World Bank, those that govern the institutions, those that have the votes in the institutions, are sent from the member countries, from the governments. And so when we're talking about some of the issues of tackling corruption, you know, beyond that $70 billion that is being lost in sub-Saharan Africa, we also have to realize that it's felt in ways that I think are even more clear. And again, we use terms like responsible lending and borrowing. But if we look at the crisis issues facing Mozambique right now, for an example, where the International Monetary Fund has stopped lending, has wanted to move forward with an audit, we are dealing with issues of corruption, where we don't have the laws we need for responsible lending and borrowing and audits on the local level. And we really don't have the appetite at this point to also pass global financial regulation on responsible lending and borrowing. One of the really interesting points that I feel the major International Monetary Fund reports make that have been released over the last 48 hours is a great concern more broadly and globally about a rollback of transparency regulations. And we're very concerned about what that means specifically for Africa when we're looking at debates in Congress right now about repealing basic regulations for extractive industries. So I know that we use big words and big statistics, but I think most of us in the communities across Africa, here in the United States, we know corruption when we see it, and we can see it's a global problem and a local problem, and we need global and local solutions.
I looked at one of your press releases, and somewhere you say that the IMF, for example, is concerned about what it characterizes as a shift in global politics. What exactly does that mean?
I think we have to understand that these particular IMF and World Bank meetings are happening in a very unique moment. We've had a global political shift, and I don't know as much from the World Bank perspective, but clearly from the International Monetary Fund perspective, they've decided to talk about that global political shift and what that means, because they're concerned about global cooperation on economic issues, on aid, on development. I think that they also are concerned that some of the changes we've seen in Europe and the United States, which again are the main votes in these institutions, but some of the changes we're seeing in Europe and in the United States seem to be a real want to roll back transparency regulation. And some of the communities and countries rolling back that transparency regulation is going to hurt the most our countries in Africa.
Do you really think that we are about to experience some kind of, where countries, frankly, perhaps don't want to interact with others, some kind of isolationism, really? Is that possible when we're talking about global economies?
It's possible. I don't think it's likely to come in full fruition, but I think what we're seeing from the International Monetary Fund are warnings right now, because they're worried. And I think we've seen new debates recently at the G7 and the G20, which illustrate, what was the former kind of status quo is shifting.
Very interesting. Reverend Okule, for once at least you can be a good guy. I mean, do you have any specific recommendations or suggestions that perhaps Albert could learn from? Albert and his institution.
The question, what would what is needed in Africa from the World Bank today it's really let me start fighting corruption, to realize that this money financial advising and transaction ends up in the pocket of very few people. In fact, in February 2013, African bishops at Madagascar, Catholic bishops from Africa at Madagascar, came up after a serious research. They said, quote, that we have to tackle corruption as #1 priority. And I'm quoting them. They said, corruption is like a cancer that stands in the way of Africa's development. So all these financial transactions without checks and balances, or they didn't actually go to the people, that's #1. Secondly, I think that if there is a means in terms of some of the financing, trying to create an environment where people themselves take ownership of what they do and apply it from their own perspective rather than from all the expert advice that comes top down, and which has led to the failure of many programs on the continent. Thirdly, I don't know whether this is really a World Bank project, but we need to find ways to make sure that Africa does not remain a land of perpetual raw material extraction. Because, you know, you talk about the DRC, you know, for over 2 decades, or going to 3 decades, Eastern DRC, about 6 million people have been killed while we loot the raw material away. So if that can enable that environment, it would be great.
Where is the leadership to do that? Let's face it, when I was a kid, I used to hear that Africa consumes what it does not produce. Africa produces what it does not consume. But I am now in my 60s, man.
But we can change that around, because really, when you look at the continent in terms of food, in terms of, okay, let me give you an example. You take a ride from Kampala to Gulu. The streets are lined up with food production. You do the same from Nairobi, from Dar es Salaam to Dodoma. Food all over, all over the countries, but the means to transport food from one place to another, the infrastructures to enable it is not there.
Let's go to, frankly, to the lifeline of the show, which are the telephone callers, so that at least we can involve some people on the African continent via the telephone. Good evening, Francis from Uganda. You are most welcome to Straight Talk Africa.
Thank you, Dr. Albert Lufra. Is there a possibility of relaxing the tough spending conditions and the religion rules for sub-Saharan Africa? How can African countries enjoy the World Bank investment of $57 billion, especially $57 billion, especially in improving the infrastructure? Thank you.
Thank you very much, except that, of course, I think, frankly, the telephone was sort of static.
Yes.
Let's go to Okolo from Nigeria. Good evening, Okolo. You're most welcome to Straight Talk Africa.
Yeah, good evening, Mr. Shah. Good evening, our guest.
I'm hugely terrific.
I want to find out from our guest. In Nigeria, we produce crude oil, and we don't produce the petrol, engine oil, diesel oil. All these things are being imported. Why is it so in Nigeria? And not only Nigeria, even in Ghana too, they have this gold and export. All these things are being exported, and the raw materials are being outside, and they are being manufactured. We are buying at exorbitant price. What are you going to tell our continent what to do so that we come out from this exportment?
Very interesting. In fact, the last time I was in Nigeria, I witnessed that. I couldn't believe it.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. How do you respond to that?
Let me first, actually agree with the Reverend. Let me agree with you on a very important advice you gave us, on diversification. And that issue of diversification is actually at the center of the work we are doing now in the Africa region of the World Bank. We are working with countries to make sure they create the right regulatory framework, build the right infrastructure for private sector to come in and diversify our economies. It's important to understand that it's not going to be our governments alone who can do this, who can transform our raw materials, add value, and diversify not only export but also markets. So this is certainly part of my own agenda as a chief economist for Africa, and this is certainly one of the things that I'm doing. I'm actually launching a whole study on positioning Africa to tap new markets in Asia, for example, those markets for value-added products. So this is certainly one point where we agree. Second, on corruption, on fighting corruption. It's like 20 years ago, President Wolfenson called corruption a cancer. So yes, we all agree that corruption is certainly one of the barriers to growth and development in Africa. But the question is, should we organize ourselves as African countries to fight corruption, or should we wait for people coming from Washington and from the World Bank and the IMF to do it? Well, it's not going to be efficient.
I think it's a global issue, really.
It's a global issue, and it's a local issue, right? Global, it takes cooperation from different countries.
It takes two to tango.
Exactly. It takes regulation from countries of origin of investments, for example, and at local level, it takes committed governments. And one of the other things I personally believe is for development to happen, you need a combination of three things. You need committed governments, committed to serving their people.
Correct.
That's one. And if you're committed to serving your people, you will certainly not organize a corruption system. Second, you need responsible private sector. And this is extremely important because not all private sector is good, right? Absolutely. But we have to be vigilant. We have to be, to make sure the right private sector, the good private sector, actually gets, the environment to flourish. And third, you need an informed citizenry.
Exactly. Exactly.
And on that point,
that's Troika.
We have been, absolutely, that's my view. But and on that point, the World Bank has been funding civil society organizations all across Africa. And as we speak, we have more than 20 civil society organizations invited to the spring meetings for us to hear directly from them, to avoid that middleman that the Reverend talked about.
I don't know whether you have come across this book written by a former colleague of yours at the bank, The Tyranny of Experts, economists, dictators,
Billy Sterling.
And the Forgotten Rights.
Billy Sterling. He was my neighbor when I was in the research department. Yes, Billy Sterling.
He says you deal with countries, frankly, who do not have policies that reflect social economic justice for their people.
Sorry.
Yes.
Because what you are just saying
you
about
have a minute, by the way.
Informed citizenship. In fact,
30 seconds.
We realize that, and the Africa Faith and Justice Network in 3 years now has been organizing local information sessions in communities, local communities, and when they get that information, they act. We call it the Just Governance and Community Empowerment Project, and it has worked wherever we have done that. People now have a case where people have even gone back to investors and renegotiate or even cancel the deal because they realize it did not favor them. So we need to carry out education. That's why I said in the beginning that development should target people primarily. When we develop people, we have them informed, then they themselves we have the environment to develop.
Unfortunately, once again, time happens not to be our best ally. On that note, thanks to our distinguished guests, Dr. Albert Zufak, Eric Lacompt, and the Reverend Dr. Nyedi Okule. Thanks to our affiliate stations, along with our viewers and listeners, we thank you for tuning in. For many of our Voice of America radio affiliates, Learning English is coming up next. And tomorrow morning's Daybreak Africa with James Bate. On behalf of the Voice of America, thanks for tuning into Straight Talk Africa. In the meantime, get better, not bitter Africa. And please remember to keep the African hopes alive.
Thank you so much.
You're most welcome.